Morning, everyone, and good morning and welcome to the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project's Brown Bag Science Speaker Series, which is, as I noted earlier, a lot of alliteration. Um, we are grateful for your presence and to our speaker today, Gavin Archbald. The topic today is about material reuse in the restoration project for raising and improving levees, for flood management, for building habitat features and islands, for eventually raising pond bottoms. It is an essential component of the restoration project itself, and projects like ours that have these overlapping needs. We have to find and import a lot of fill material to successfully move forward with these projects. And this is it's really important. It's where construction and project implementation meet science, and that interface of how we find material, how we make sure it's clean and safe enough to use, how we overcome the various challenges of importing it and placing it safely, working around different constraints. These are all some of our biggest challenges, and it also ties in with the adaptive management plan and our project's commitment to long-term science by its use of these material testing and screening requirements, by the cleanliness standards, things like that. And there are a few entities more familiar with that process than H.D. Harvey and Associates, who has been working on that aspect of our project, of the South Bay Shoreline Project, and others for almost a decade now. And so we're privileged to have Gavin Archbald from H.D. Harvey and Associates, who is one of that firm's leads on this bit of work. And many of you know Gavin, but if you don't, I will note that he is a restoration ecologist who has been at H.D. Harvey for, I think, since 2010 or so, since finishing his master's degree at San Francisco State University. He's a restoration ecologist. I have been working with him now for almost 6 years in this role. Gavin's gonna just rock your world today. So take it away. We've got about a 35-minute talk or so, followed by plenty of time for questions and answered and discussion on the various parts of this. So thanks for that.
What a great introduction. I don't know about rocking your world, but hopefully we'll talk about putting soil into the world, and that's pretty similar. All right, I'm going to share my screen and get the PowerPoint going here. It's really fun to see so many familiar names and faces. Thanks everyone for being here. All right, let me just switch that. Okay, my screens have been aligned. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, thanks so much for the introduction and thanks for the opportunity to present today. I really appreciate it. I did my master's at San Francisco State University, and that's when I started working with the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project as a graduate fellow, and I really fell in love with the project. I'm sure that you all feel the same and have a lot of passion for this project. So it's an honor to get to come here and contribute to the Brown Bag Lunch series. I'm Gavin Archbald. I'm an Associate Restoration Ecologist with H.D. Harvey, and I've been working on helping to implement and oversee and develop the soil import process for about the last 7 or 8 years for our firm. And so the talk is called Upland Soil for Marsh Restoration in the Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge. And today I'll talk about first why the refuge needs upland soil, and then where that soil comes from, how it's acquired. Then I'll get into the Quality Assurance Project Plan, or QAPP, which is the process that oversees or lays out the rules of the road for importing soil into the refuge, and then how that document has kind of changed over time to meet the needs of these projects, how it's being modified currently, and then throughout the talk I'll provide examples of soil import projects. So one of the main reasons that the refuge needs upland soil is to carry out the large-scale wetland restoration projects that are, planned and being implemented implemented in the refuge. And of course, the largest of those is the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. That's shown here with an orange outline for the 3 different pond complexes. The Ravenswood Pond Complex and the Alviso Complex are both located in the Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge. Eden Landing is not, that's on state-owned land. And another large project being implemented in the refuge that requires imported fill material is the Shoreline Project, which is shown here with the dark blue oval. And in general, the way that upland soil is used for these projects primarily is as fill for terrestrial marsh transition zones or T-zones between the edges of ponds that are going to be restored or have now been restored to tidal marsh and the adjacent upland. And then also for coastal flood protection, excuse me. And in particular, that is a component of the Shoreline project. And just to mention, probably as an overview, that the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project's goal is to restore about 15,000 acres of former industrial salt pond to a mix of tidal marsh and other habitats. And the way that tidal marsh is being restored in the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project and the Shoreline Project, it's not through importing upland terrestrial fill currently. The way that these marshes are being restored is by breaching the ponds, allowing the bay to carry in sediment and raise the elevation of those ponds. The upland terrestrial fill is really used to support and prepare these marshes for that kind of restoration. The sites that I have circled here, I'm going to dive a little bit more deeply into. These are project sites in purple that are part of phase 2 of the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. And we've been helping to oversee the import of fill material into these project sites. So I'll dive more deeply into these 4 project locations. So I'm going to start with the Ravenswood Pond Complex. Here, fill soil was imported over about 3 or 4 years to build a terrestrial transition zone along the interior edge of Pond R4, and also to build up the internal levees, including the All-American Canal and internal levees in R5 and S5. And this was a necessary step prior to breach. The breach happened in 2023. I'm sure a lot of you were there, and that was such an exciting moment. And so now R4 is open to tides, and these transition zones are in place. Fill is also needed at ponds A1 and A2W to create, again, transition zones between these ponds, which will return to marsh and the adjacent upland, and also to improve the levee between Charleston Slough and Pond A1. And soil import was successfully completed in September, so just last month of 24, into A2W. This fill is now in place, and the pond, or the terrestrial fill at Pond A1 is still forthcoming. Pond A8 is another part of phase 2 of the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. Here, fill material, again, used to construct transition zones. You can see there's a break here in the transition zone where San Tomas Aquino Creek may be reconnected into Pond A8. This fill came in over several years, and Valley Water Stream Maintenance Program was a large contributor to the fill material along Pond A8. Import is now complete. And then the Shoreline Project, which is ongoing, is another driver of importing fill. This project is constructing 5 miles of flood risk management levee along ponds A12, A13, A16, and this levee is now complete. The levee along Pond A18 is still forthcoming, And this project will also create about 90 acres of transition zone along the outboard edges of Reach 1 and Reaches 4 and 5. So it takes a lot of fill material to build these transition zones, and of course to provide the coastal flood protection as well. Why are we building these transition zones? They provide really important habitat diversity between the marsh and the adjacent upland. The South Bay historically had very broad transition zones. These have been almost entirely lost. So this is recreating some of that habitat type at the edge of our marshes. Transition zones provide a buffer for water quality, for disturbance between the upland and species using the marsh and the marshes. They support vegetation that during extreme high tides provides refugia cover for ridgeways, rails, salt marsh harvest mice, and other vertebrates that use the marsh. And when these are broad and flat enough, they can provide some sea level rise accommodation space as well. And then I kind of want to make the point that the fill to construct the earthen flood risk management levees at the shoreline project and the terrestrial transition zones, this fill is needed to be imported, and these features need to be constructed before ponds can be breached. And so the availability of getting that fill affects the trajectory of marsh restoration. There's different things that will determine. I'm showing you here the ponds A9 through A15, which are outboard of Reach 1 of the shoreline project. So this is where the terrestrial transition zone is being constructed, or is going to be constructed rather. And the future of what this habitat's going to look like depends on a couple of things. It depends on when this breach occurs. It depends on how much sediment is in the natural system to supply this pond with sediment. And it depends on the rate of sea level rise, what kind of trajectory this marsh is going to experience. And we don't have control of the sediment supply in the bay. We don't have control of the sea level rise trajectory, but we can try to provide fill to get these shoreline features constructed as quick as we can to allow that breach to happen. That's the one piece of this that I think we have the most direct control over. There are other needs for upland fill in the refuge besides the restoration projects. For example, maintaining berms. The refuge has 70 miles of berms that now are under its management when that land was acquired from Cargill. And the refuge has been carrying out projects to improve berms to avoid accidental or unintended breaches. And an example of a project that imported terrestrial fill to beef up one of the berms is around Pond R1. The refuge completed that project a few years back now. So the shoreline project and the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project and maintaining berms, all that takes fill material, but that's just sort of the known planned projects. There's likely going to be a need for fill material to help restore and sustain marshes with sea level rise as well. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with San Francisco Estuary Institute's report, Sediment Survival, that quantifies the need for sediment in the South Bay. These numbers shown here are just for the South Bay. 53 million cubic yards of sediment are needed between 2010 and 2050 to raise up these subsided pond bottoms from former salt ponds up to tidal marsh elevations, and for existing marshes to keep pace with sea level rise. But only about 1/10 of that volume of sediment is expected to be provided, by natural processes. So there's this big deficit in the amount of sediment that's needed. And, in the future, I think that upland fill material will be part of that solution. So right now, where does the upland fill material come from? That's been imported and is being imported into the refuge. A lot of it comes from private construction projects. I'm showing you here a cut fill map from a commercial development building that was evaluated for suitability for reuse. this commercial development building was cutting down into the ground to create a basement, or maybe it was a parking garage for this commercial building, down to about 15 feet below the ground surface. And this was generating a substantial amount of fill material, 56,000 cubic yards. So this is the kind of project that has been really successful in providing fill going into the refuge. Other examples of sources of fill are from public projects, and Valley Water's stream maintenance program is a good example of a public project that has successfully brought in fill to the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. Privately owned quarries provide a source of material, and this fill can be brought in. Really, there's sort of two main ways that on the projects that H.G. Harvey has been working on that we've seen it brought in. One is through what's referred to as the free dirt market. It's essentially where a project site that needs fill material opens up that site to dirt brokers and contractors as essentially as a disposal material for clean fill that meets the screening criteria in the QAPP. And if a contractor finds that material and it's they can make money off of bringing it to the project site, then it can come in at very low cost to the project itself, to the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. The downside of the free dirt market is it can take a long time for dirt to become available. It really depends on where there are commercial development projects, or I should say private development projects happening. If they're close enough to the project site to be profitable for the dirt broker, when those come online, then the project can get fill material, but you don't necessarily have control of the timeline. The second main way of importing fill material that we've seen is contracting, paying for dirt through an RFP process where a contractor, multiple contractors bid to provide a certain volume of soil over a certain timeline. And of course, you have a lot more certainty to get the fill material, but the cost of that is higher. This is a map showing the sources of fill material that have moved into these 4 project areas that I've been talking about: Ravenswood, Pond A2W, A8, and the Shoreline Project, reaches 1 through 3. The green stars are showing private construction projects that contributed fill to these projects, and the blue stars are public projects. Most of them here in the Santa Clara Valley are from Valley Water's stream maintenance program sites, or actually all of them in this area are. But just to notice the pattern that, these borrow sites are almost all very close to the project site locations, and that's really because the cost of trucking soil is really high. In order for soil material to become available and be profitable for a contractor or a dirt broker through the free dirt market, it needs to be a very close location to keep that trucking cost low. And similarly, if a contractor is in a competitive bidding, competition against another contractor to supply soil through an RFP, they're more likely to win that bid if they have access to a borrow site that's close by to keep that cost low. Good upland soil to import to these projects that meet the criteria in the QAPP, in the Quality Assurance Project Plan, it's hard to find that soil material. Once a contractor or a dirt broker is engaged in trying to find soil for a project, be that through an RFP or the free dirt market, those dirt brokers are looking at multiple potential job sites that might supply that soil and rejecting most of those before they ever come to the project for consideration. And the main reasons for that are legacy contamination in the urbanized edge of the bay. I'm showing you Regional Water Quality Control Board's GeoTracker website showing known locations of contaminants in the soil. And so you can imagine there's a lot of project sites that, when initial testing is done to see if it might be suitable, come out with levels of contaminants that are higher than the screening limits for import to the refuge. Even when a clean borrow site is found in terms of legacy contamination, the local geology can cause the site to not meet the screening criteria. In particular, metals, cadmium, selenium, and nickel are three common metals that can occur in strata in the Bay Area naturally, not through any contamination, but that causes site to not meet the screening criteria. Project sites are rejected because of transport costs or the scale. It's just too small of a project to be cost effective. But the most promising sites are sent along to the project team to verify the suitability of that borrow site for beneficial reuse in the refuge. And that's really where the quality assurance project plan comes in. It's a written document that describes a process to evaluate and approve and oversee the imported fill material into the refuge to make sure that fill is protective of aquatic life. Phase 2 permits for the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project require a QAPP be implemented. So does the Shoreline Project permits, and it's a requirement in both the Regional Water Quality Control Board and BCDC permits for the projects. The origins of this document, the first version of the QAPP was developed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2008 to guide fill import into Inner Bear Island. And it was successfully used for that restoration project. About 1 million cubic yards of upland fill material were placed to raise the bottom of Inner Bear Island up to tidal marsh elevation ranges. And then as phase 2 of the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project was getting underway, the project team realized they didn't want to, it wouldn't be practical to create a QAPP for each new project site that opens up in the refuge. Instead, it would make more sense to develop something called a master QAPP, like an overarching document that would cover any fill import project in the refuge. So that document was first created a master QAPP version was created in 2017, and then it's been revised a few times. The current version that's being used is the 2021 version, and there's now a revised version that I'll talk about what changes there are between 21 and 24. There's a 2024 version that's being reviewed now by the Regional Water Quality Control Board in BCDC. And the creation of these documents has been a collaborative process between lots of different folks. H.T. Harvey has been an author on the 2017 and 2021 and 2024 documents. TRC Solutions has provided a peer review role and also technical support for developing aspects of the QAPP. The Refuge, of course, has been involved reviewing drafts and very supportive of this whole process. The South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project and Coastal Conservancy have helped to fund versions of the QAPP, including the current one that's in review now. Pacific States Environmental, which is a dirt broker contractor that's brought in a lot of soil, also funded the 2017 version of the QAPP. And the Army Corps contributed screening criteria, guidance to the 2021 version. And they also provided like a peer review capacity, and that Valley Waters contributed funding to modify the QAPP. And then the board and BCTC throughout this process have been engaged, supportive, helpful in moving this document forward. So it's really been a regional collaboration. The way that the QAPP works is that it sets contaminant screening limits that need to be met in order for soil to be imported, for metals, for pesticides, PCBs, total petroleum hydrocarbons, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and volatile organic compounds. So these are classes of contaminants, and then there are multiple individual constituent contaminants within each of these classes that are evaluated. Then there's 2 sets of screening criteria. One set, the most restrictive, if you will, difficult to meet, protective of aquatic life is the screening criteria for wetland surface material, which is placed within the first 3 feet of the surface of a marsh. So this is the soil material that biota is a direct contact with. And then there are slightly higher screening limits for a second class of material called foundation material. And because the screening limits are a bit higher, it's generally easier to find this material, but it's also kind of hard to work with. It needs to be placed in a location and kind of feathered into a construction process in a way that doesn't slow things down and that is then capped by that surface material. These screening limits are largely derived from the Regional Water Quality Control Board's screening criteria for beneficial reuse of dredge materials, which in that document and some modifications to the QAPP are ultimately based on biotic effect studies for the most part. So studies of contaminant levels at which organisms are or are not affected by individual specific contaminants. The QAPP sets up roles and defines what each of these different roles, the responsibilities of each of these 3 roles. There's a contractor who finds dirt material, brings in that dirt material, carries out chain of custody documentation that's required by the QAPP. There's a quality assurance officer who helps to review data and looks over the contractor's role to make sure that they're following all the steps of the QAPP. And then there's a peer reviewer that reviews the quality assurance officer's judgment about the acceptability of material coming into the refuge. And so H.T. Harvey has been playing the role of quality assurance officer on the 4 sites that I've been talking about. So I want to just talk a little bit more about what that quality assurance role looks like to help, I guess, folks appreciate the level of scrutiny that goes into reviewing and approving material and then overseeing its import. When a contractor identifies a potential borrow source that may be suitable for the refuge, the first thing the quality assurance officer does is review all information about the site history of that borrow site and do some digging on our own to look at historic aerial images and understand what are the possible causes of contamination at that project site. Then we either develop or review a sample plan that may have already been implemented at that project site to see if that's a suitable level of sampling to meet the QAPP and to test for those possible sources of contaminants. Often the sample plan needs more samples, and so we will recommend the location for those, review analytic testing data. Often there is follow-up sampling that's needed to isolate a portion of the site that's suitable for reuse, perhaps from a portion that isn't. And then once a volume of soil has been found, then it goes through the approval process. You summarize all the data, it gets peer reviewed, and the recommendation for approval goes to the board and BCDC for their review, sometimes questions and problem solving there. And then once a volume is approved, it moves into import. As it's being imported, there is oversight that the quality assurance officer provides, and then there's a reporting step as well. I want to just touch on the import oversight process because it's really a fundamental part of the quality assurance. Essentially, this is its chain of custody documentation for literally every truck of soil that moves from a borrow site into a project site. So at a borrow site where material is being loaded into a truck for transport, every truck driver is handed a unique document called a truck manifest. It's a piece of paper that shows the origin of that soil material and what that material is. What it consists of is it wetland surface or foundation. And then that truck drives to the project site, and there's a gatekeeper there that is looking for those forms and collecting those forms. If a truck driver doesn't have that manifest, then they're required to be turned away by the QAPP. There's a gatekeeper who is logging every single truck that comes on site and the timing of their arrival, the truck number, et cetera, so that can be compared to the truck manifest record by the quality assurance officer. If material doesn't go directly to the project site, if it goes to an off-site stockpile location, then those manifests need to be collected at the stockpile location. There's again a gatekeeper, and when material is loaded back into another truck on another day to actually come to the project site, again, they have to get truck manifests. So the chain of custody process has to be maintained wherever that soil goes. There's also random site visits that the quality assurance officer is required to make to document and make sure that the contractor is following these procedures. So going back to project examples, at the Ravenswood Pond Complex, there was a location that was used to import foundation material, which was a benefit to the project. It helped to speed up the overall rate that soil material was provided. And that's the All-American Canal. This was a good location for foundation material because it's essentially a canal that's hemmed in on either side by berms, and the foundation material was placed in there, and then 3 feet of wetland surface material was placed on top of that. Some more photos of soil being imported to Ravenswood to construct the 30-to-1 transition zone. This is in 2018, 2019, and 2021 when that 30-to-1 ecotone was complete and before the pond was breached. It took for the portion of soil import that Harvey documented, it was about 320,000 cubic yards of upland fill material that were imported for all those improvements over a 3 to 4 year period. And so, but there were 1.6 million cubic yards of material that were identified and approved through the QAPP process. So it goes to show that there's a lot more material that gets approved than imported in the free dirt market, because this material, even when it's approved for the refuge project, there's still a market that's in play, and that material will sometimes be diverted or often diverted elsewhere as well. And it took 19 separate private construction projects to supply that 320,000 cubic yards. The shoreline project, another example here. First, about 100,000 cubic yards were stockpiled in Pond A12 as fill to construct the Reach 1 through 3 FRM levee. This soil material came from 6 different private construction sites and 1 quarry, and this was purchased through a contracting process. The shoreline project introduced a few new needs for the QAPP to kind of cover and document in terms of quality assurance, and that is the need to mix soil bodies. There's no one borrow site that was found for this project that both met the wetland surface criteria for import to the refuge and also met the geotechnical specifications to construct the FRM levee. So to solve that challenge, the contractor mixed multiple borrow sources that were each individually approved as wetland surface material, using very specialized equipment. This machine basically runs back and forth along about a 3-foot deep lift of soil and thoroughly mixes that. And this was used to meet that geotechnical specification. And the board in BCDC worked with us to develop oversight methods, kind of as this need arose, in order to keep that chain of custody documentation in place during soil mixing. Another example of a challenge with the shoreline project that is now being implemented or is being integrated into the QAPP is tracking stockpiles at an off-site stockpile location. So this is a privately owned quarry that was used as a location to stockpile approved borrow material and also to carry out soil mixing. So these like lined stockpiles here are mixes that have been blended. So there's one here, there's another one here that you can see. There's other activities going on at the quarry for this project, refining native in situ material, refining that material to be incorporated into the mixes. And there are stockpiles from borrow sites that were imported by truck from various construction projects and that are going to also be added into these mixes. And so every one of these stockpiles needs to be tracked at a level where if the stockpile changes its configuration, as a quality assurance officer, we need to understand why and make sure that any change in a stockpile is the result of a planned, activity that's directly related to the project. And so that was done through aerial image acquisition, regular aerial image acquisition, and also site visits and really close collaboration with the quarry operators. So the shoreline project has now completed reach 1 through 3 levee core construction. It took about, and that's what this photo is showing here, is the reaches 2, 3. We have pond A16 off here. This is a photo from about 2 weeks ago, showing the completed earthen levee before it's been revegetated or top dressed. It took about 500,000 cubic yards over 2 years. It required 22 different borrow sites and 12 unique soil mixes to construct the levee. So now I'm going to transition into the last part of my presentation, which talks about ways that the QAPP is being modified. So the QAPP is a living document, and the community of folks who are interested in seeing this document and these projects move forward have been very supportive of modifying and improving the QAPP over time. One of the key goals of modifying the QAPP is to try to allow more material, try to allow more sites to be acceptable and suitable for reuse without jeopardizing aquatic life. So where are the corners and edges of this QAPP screening process that can be modified that can safely import more fill material? Some examples of changes that have been made to the QAPP in the past are foundation material was added in that wasn't originally part of the QAPP. There are statistical methods that are incorporated into the QAPP starting in 2021 that allow for, if you have a borrow site and you have 1 or 2 samples that have an exceedance above a screening limit, as long as the volume as a whole meets the screening criteria as sort of tested through one of these statistical methods, if that material is all going to the same place in the refuge, it can still be suitable for import. These are basically industry standard statistical methods that were incorporated into the QAPP. And then I'll talk about, on the next few slides, some more modifications that are being incorporated in the current version of the QAPP. I'm going to touch on here a conceptual site model that was prepared. This was requested by the Regional Water Quality Control Board as a basis for future changes to the QAPP. And the purpose of this document is to evaluate exposure pathways from sources of terrestrial fill as they are handled and then placed in different locations in the refuge, either as wetland foundation or surface material. What are the pathways that those contaminants can come into contact with a representative ecological receptor in the refuge? So this document, without going into a ton of detail on it, there is a standalone report that documents this conceptual site model. It's a tool for thinking about, how contaminants move from a borrow site to these receptors and how concentrations of contaminants may change as a result of that process, and in what cases are contaminants not going to be in contact with receptors. It's a tool for thinking that through. And one concrete outcome from this model is that thinking about primary loss mechanisms, when material is handled through excavation, through screening or refining of soil, like you saw a photo of, transport, stockpiling, placing out onto a levee surface, for example, that process exposes the soil material that was in the ground now to, to the atmosphere. And so volatile organic compounds that are in the soil that may be at concentrations that are unsuitable when that dirt is in the ground, once it's handled and moved around, those concentrations could decrease before that material comes into contact with aquatic life. So one of the proposed modifications to the 2024 QAPP includes a volatilization sample plan that's worked into the document. This is a proposed change that would allow a contractor and quality assurance officer, if there's an exceedance for a VOC at a borrow site, you can dig up where those concentrations are highest and simulate handling that material and then retest it. And if VOCs are now within the screening limits for reuse, then that material could be approved for import. The 2024 QAPP will also, or is proposing to revise screening limits for 25 individual VOCs to be based on marine receptors rather than freshwater receptors, which is more reflective of the habitats that the soil material is being placed in the refuge. Another modification being proposed is mixing borrow sites to achieve the surface criteria. Mixing was done successfully to meet geotechnical specifications, but now it's being proposed, say at one borrow site and it had an exceedance for a metal, say cadmium, and the other one, another borrow site, had a very low cadmium level in that soil. If you blend these soils together, mix them very thoroughly using specialized equipment, not just rip them together, but you have to use a very particular kind of soil mixing process. The resulting soil body now meets the screening criteria, then that is an acceptable way to generate material for import and beneficial reuse. And then the QAPP also is going to formalize some of the chain of custody documentation that was developed during the shoreline project for soil stockpiling offsite and mixing soil. So just to kind of summarize some of the main points from this talk, upland soil is needed to build transition zones and levees, and this need is going to continue as the bay edge is adapted to prepare for sea level rise. Many potential borrow sites, close by to where you'd like to find that soil are not suitable because of legacy contamination. But deeper digs, basement digs of private construction projects that are generating fill from, pretty deep in the soil profile below where you have your surficial contamination, quarries that have native soil in them, stream sediment excavation projects, those have provided sources, viable, good sources for fill material for refuge projects. And then, it's really been the collaboration and support of the board in BCDC and, funding from the Coastal Conservancy, funding from Valley Water and others that's led to this document, improving and being modified. And of course, support from the refuge and their collaboration as well. And yeah, with that, I'd be happy to move into our conversation part of our time together. Thanks a lot.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Gavin. That was very thorough, very clear, and good graphics. I like those. Good photos. We do have a bunch in the chat. Some things have been answered, but there's a couple hands raised in the room, and that's a little more engaging than me reading things from the chat. So Lauren, your hand was up first. I don't know if you want to ask your question live, and then we'll go to Nick Mascarello after that. Oh, maybe Lauren took his hand down. Nick, go for it.
I apologize. That was a totally accidental hand raise. I didn't even realize I clicked on it.
Well, very nice. That's true for both of you. Okay, do we have any other questions in the room before I go to the chat? Not seeing anything, so that's great. Oh, there's Brenda. Go ahead.
Hi, I had a question, Gavin. So for the shoreline project, is the soil, in other words, is the soil mixing just for the geotechnical qualities of a flood protection levee in the shoreline project? You don't have to do that for the ecotone or T-zone, yet another term, because we
Yes.
don't have enough for this transition zone. Is it happening in that as well?
So it isn't yet. It is
Okay.
it just has been used, the soil mixing, to create geotechnically suitable material for the
flood
FRF
control
levee core.
Yeah, okay.
For the shoreline project, material was also imported for earthen coffer dams, for example, pretty decent volumes of material, and that didn't get mixed. It didn't need to be mixed. And then for the transition zones, you could, if the 2024 version of the QAPP, once it's formally approved and accepted by the board in BCDC, then it would create the option of mixing borrow sites for that transition zone, if with the purpose. It wouldn't be needed for geotechnical purposes, but it might be needed to help make wetland surface material available, because if you have two bodies of soil, one that meets the criteria and the other that doesn't, but if you blend them together, then it does, then that becomes a tool in the toolbox.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
It's a big opportunity, Brenda, to be able to do that. We've really had some challenges with getting to that. It took several years of discussion. No, it's great. I see some hands up from Jen Siu. And Jen, you put some things in the chat too. So why don't you pick your favorite of those things and go ahead.
Actually, none of those things. I wanted to talk about the evolution of your process, Dave. And, looking at that first project, you pretty much got only 20% of the material that was available. It was like 318 to 1.6 million cubic yards, right? So I did a quick stats, 20%. But then the shoreline, you had a much better stat. So do you feel like could we talk a little bit about, I mean, maybe you disagree, but could we talk a little bit about why you think it's improving? Is it the QAPP? Is it because Gavin talked a little bit about the trucking issues and some of these issues. Does anything rise to the top in terms of how you've been able to improve that, getting the capacity you need?
That's a lot of layers there. The first one you're referring to Bear Island, I guess, right? Is that?
Was that the statistic? Was that the 300?
It was from, do you mind if I jump in?
Yeah,
please.
Yeah, it was from Ravenswood.
Oh, the Ravenswood one. Okay.
Yeah, and that was using, and the big difference like between Ravenswood and Shoreline Project that I see, and Dave, I maybe have a different take, but the free dirt market, you're in competition with other job sites where that approved material is going to end up going. And so the contractor, when it's economically advantageous, will bring it over to Ravenswood. But if some other, contractor finds a way to do it cheaper, they'll be able to move that dirt and then go there instead. Whereas the Shoreline Project, they're paying for dirt. So it's like they get a borrow site, they're paying for that whole thing. Contractor's going to bid on that, and they're going to bring probably that whole thing into the Shoreline Project. So that the kind of the percent of volume approved versus volume actually brought in, I think, is a function of the free dirt market versus the pay for, largely.
That's exactly right.
Thank you.
If somebody's buying dirt, they're going to get it before we are. Go ahead, Ralph. It's great to see you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question about biosolids. I'm from the wastewater community, and we have a tremendous issue with disposing of biosolids now. Is there any consideration in the project for using biosolids?
We haven't yet. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Gavin. Yeah, I'm never sure when people ask the project, you know, it could be the restoration project or shoreline or any of the other projects around the bay. So, but Gavin touches all of those. So go ahead.
Okay.
Just going to say that we haven't had any analysis, like I haven't seen any analysis of biosolids compared to the screening levels in the QAPP. But if we had that data to look at, then we could at least give a read on how, you know, how, like for the contaminants in the QAPP, how does it compare?
So I'll have Jackie Zipkin from East Bay Discharges Authority do that for you.
Sure.
That'd be helpful.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyone else in the room? Oh, Ellen Jonk is here. Hello, go ahead.
Hi,
Ellen.
how are you? Hi, all.
Great.
Say, we've come a long way, baby, from Bear Island. Yeah. So, kind of along the lines of Jen's question on process. You know, I've been involved with a number of committees. One, the big project that Brenda has got BCDC has a contract with EPA for a beneficial use study, and we're coming up with a plan for action about how more material can get to this mission of raising the elevation of these ponds in the South Bay and of course beneficial use elsewhere, but we're talking South Bay right now. You know, I brought up the very interesting subject of I helped the state of New Jersey with the creation of an Office of Maritime Resources, which actually is the hub for any project that's going to beneficial use. They funnel it, they fan it out and work with their EPA for the state to figure out the environmental parameters. And you know, I offered that up as an example of something we could create for, you know, for the Bay that would be more of a hub and get you faster, supposedly faster action than maybe the process that we're going through right now. But that's just a thought on, and that office, by the way, is in the Department of Transportation for the state of New Jersey. And so, and I'm working on some transportation projects, basically water transit and the Bay, but I was thinking about a source of material from the proposed BART expansion down in the South Bay, and whether that would be, you know, offer up a lot of material in a way. Have you looked at that? Have you?
Gavin and I work on that all the time with VTA.
You're working on that right now.
We're
Okay.
looking at it. There's a
Okay.
yeah. I mean, we're down to our last few minutes, Ellen, so I don't want to go into too much
Okay, that's
detail on
right.
this. But the really
bigger
short
picture.
answer, the really short answer is that the additives used for tunneling need to be tested and screened to make sure that they don't make the dirt itself, the tunnel muck coming out of the ground, that they don't make it toxic in the biotic environment. HT Harvey has designed and Gavin's involved in this, developing a bioassay plan to study that in a range of different organisms.
Okay,
and assuming that's clean enough, then we have to take the next step of VTA needs to do a CEQA document and design, and how are they going to get it there, and what are the impacts of trucking and placement and turbidity and water, all the other things, right? So it's super challenging.
Right.
But
Okay.
we are
So you're in deep with that. Okay. And just further thoughts about the, you know, eventual process. How do we get more outreach to get more material in and more people involved? That's all.
No, it's a great idea. We've been on that for a while. Gavin, do you have anything to add on the VTA information before we take a couple last questions from the chat?
I think you summarized it well. It's a really great opportunity, and it does introduce some new challenges to try to figure out if it's suitable, and it has to do with the soil conditioners.
Yeah, no, it's a great idea, Ellen. Just I'm flipping through the chat, and you know, if you put one in there, some of them have been answered if they were clean and easy. You know, there were questions in there about invasive plant management, for example, right? And we wanted to make sure that that, you know, people understood that usually when we're doing upland material, that the top few feet is contaminated with enough past land use stuff that it's usually not reusable anyway, and that's where the seed bank tends to be. So these deeper excavations don't have the seed banks, and so that's not such a big deal. Ava Samuels, if you're still on the line, do you want to ask your question out loud or should I read it? All right, I'll just read it for you.
I can ask my
Oh, go ahead.
question.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Hold on, let me find it and remind myself. Oh, yeah, I was just curious about the risks of erosion to each of these projects and if the importing soil fill will need to be a continuous thing or if a one-time import would be enough to satisfy the projects.
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, so for the shoreline project, for example, their pond A12 it's deeply subsided. When it's breached, it's going to be subtidal habitat, maybe low intertidal mudflat. It's going to take time for that sediment to accumulate. And during that time, yeah, there's erosion potential on that transition zone. And one thing that in the ecotone design that we're trying to do to slow that down is to install sacrificial mounds along the toe of the earthen sacrificial mounds along the toe of the ecotone that are meant to erode and contribute sediment onto the ecotone plane and give time for marsh vegetation to establish on the lower part of the ecotone slope before those sacrificial mounds wear down. But you know that I do think there's going to be a risk on any of these transition zones. You got your wind waves coming off of a pond. They're going to start eating into that side slope. And there may need to be something like once your marsh finally accretes, that may take decades, right? For your marsh to reach a tidal marsh elevation. At that point, if you have a little scarp between your T-zone or now your marsh and then the T-zone, something may need to be done to fix that in the future. But I think projects are planning, trying to find ways to creatively deal with that erosion. And then we're going to have to wait and see what happens.
Yeah. So we are at time. I see Donna has her hand up. We don't cut off instantly, do we? At noon, we're okay if we bleed over a couple minutes. Go ahead, Donna.
Well, I just saw a question in the chat, and maybe this is probably worth answering for the group, is the cost of doing this trucking of soil versus the cost of moving dredged material. I think that's probably an interesting question for people to hear the answer to.
It is. And we have a lot of different opinions on such things. Gavin, why don't you go first?
I actually haven't really studied the dredge industry in terms of the costs and done a comparison, so I don't have a good answer for that.
Okay. I can sort of address the big picture question. There's a difference between cost and price, right? We know a little bit about the price, like when we have to pay for dirt. And somebody asked in the chat, was all the Ravenswood dirt free? Almost all of it. We did have to pay some added hauling cost for added distance when we did buy some dirt as well. But we did get probably almost all of that for free, as I think was talked about earlier. But we know what the truckers will charge us when we buy either dirt and hauling, or when we just pay for hauling. We have a couple of price points on that, but we don't know the true cost because those are private sector industries, right? We don't know how much profit they're making. That's not our right to know, right? They're private entities and they can charge what they want if there's a market. So we have some points on those. Dredging is slightly different because it's been studied for a lot longer and there's a lot more sort of regulatory involvement in the dredging material reuse industry. And so the big question is, it depends how far you have to move it in both of those cases, right? How much are you moving and how far away from the source are you trying to take it? Those costs change differentially depending on distance and how you get it there. And there's also a difference between trucking dredge material, in which case, as somebody else put in the chat, you have to dry it out and then put it in the truck and move it. And that means needing a giant space to dry it out. And that's not available almost anywhere, right? But if you can keep it in the water and take it from the dredge boat and put it into a basin and pump bay water in and mix it and pump it into place, well, that's a more direct system. You don't have to truck it and you don't have to dry it, but you have to set up that offloader system and the pumps, and you have to operate those. And that is also expensive. So dredge material reuse is really, really expensive. I think overall trucking is cheaper for upland fill material because it's already dry, it's already coming out of the ground, and it's already getting put in a truck to go to a landfill anyway. And so the only thing we need to do is keep the testing and screening and the tracking costs that Gavin talked so thoroughly about, right? That how do we sample the material? How do we test it? How do we make sure the lab work is appropriate? And how do we track the movement of that truck from the site, you know, and how do we make sure it's placed where it said it was going to go, things like that. Those are costs. They are much smaller than setting up an offloader or a slurry pipe to pump dredge material around, right? So we can control those costs. They are smaller, and then we just have to worry about the actual distance, right? Those are the sort of big picture takes on cost. And there was a number of different questions that Amar and others asked in the chat. So I kind of tried to bundle a bunch of those. I don't know if that's probably a fire hose for some of you, but I have COVID, and so I'm a little punchy and stupid today. Anything to add on that big picture, Gavin?
Okay, no, that was great, Dave.
Okay.
Dave, if you don't mind me chiming in, I
No,
think
please.
it might still be on the Salt Ponds website, maybe. There was a study done by Moffat and Nickel back before I retired about feasibility of pumping. And
Yep.
I guess the gist was far South Bay, very expensive, lots of infrastructure and electric costs.
Yeah.
Eden Landing more feasible. So if somebody wants to really have a good time and dig into all that, it's probably in the archives on the website.
It for sure is. Interested parties, you are welcome to go to southbayrestoration.org, go to the project library. You can search, there's a search tool in there that you just put in, you know, dredge reuse or you know, beneficial reuse, things like that. You will find all the documents we have on these. We are over time, and I see that some people are dropping off, although we've got pretty good stick around. Thanks to you all for your attendance and your interest and your participation. It's great to see and hear so many familiar faces and names. Thanks again to Gavin and his colleagues at HC Harvey Associates, not only for the presentation today, which was thoughtful and well delivered, but for so many years of good and thoughtful collaborative work on all of this. I am very grateful to you all for that. So with that, I think we will end the recording, and I see Ariel nodding, right? You'd be jumping up and down if I were saying something wrong. So we're going to call it there. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.